Alright guys, Murph's here. And today, we're going to be talking about 300 Blackout. We're going to talk about some of the history, development, some of its performance aspects, a little bit of comparison, as well as kind of my thoughts on uses and proper application of the 300 Blackout. Now, let's go ahead and get into the history portion, shall we? So, for a long time, many years in military circles, suppressor hosts were considered to be submachine guns, pistol caliber weapon systems, small, lightweight, well suited to confined spaces, and also being suppressor hosts because pistol caliber cartridges are readily adaptable to being subsonic in velocity, which means that it doesn't take as much effort to make it work well with the suppressor. Now, there's a couple things we got to keep in mind whenever it is that we're talking about suppressor type use. Everyone has a tendency to think that suppressors are Hollywood silent, to where people in the next room won't necessarily hear the shot being discharged. And that's not entirely true. There's a lot of things that play into that and impact it: bullet selection, actual cartridge length, the barrel length of the suppressor. There's a lot of things that play into that. Most of the time, I think you would consider successful suppressor application from a silence type aspect or diminished report to be successful if somebody, say in the next building, didn't hear the discharge of the shot. But generally, there's still going to be quite a bit of noise associated with the gunshot. The question is it hearing safe or not? And does it alert people far away? You know, perhaps a unsuppressed gunshot could be heard for blocks, if not miles, whereas a suppressed gunshot either A, disguises the location of that gunshot, or does not advertise the exact location, like, you know, within a certain area, diminishes the distance that it can be heard. Now, it's great that pistol bullets are readily adaptable to this type of application. However, most of the time, nobody wants to fight with a pistol. Now, this is an important thing here. You fight with pistols, and we talked about this before on this channel. You fight with pistols because rifles are not applicable. And in this case, rifles during this time period, especially even, or I shouldn't say especially, but even in, that's what I'm trying to say, even in intermediate cartridges are just not readily suppressible. You're still going for supersonic type velocities and all that kind of stuff. So there's a pretty good possibility that you're breaking, that no matter what you try to do with the suppressor, you're never going to get that anywhere near that movie silent with those types of rounds. And if you try to up the overall grainage, you wind up drastically diminishing the effectiveness of the cartridge. So it was easier to just go with pistol caliber cartridges and shoot somebody more times. Now, in a submachine gun, you do have a little bit longer barrel that you'll find on average with your handguns, so you get a little bit more velocity. But ultimately, you're still not in a positive dynamic with an energy transfer. And if you're talking about it with a military sense, where you're really not supposed to be using, we're not really supposed to be using hollow points and all that kind of stuff, you could really see where this dynamic gets impacted when you have to solely run off of FMJs and you have to restrict yourself on velocity. It's not the best overall application. Now, eventually, with advancements in powders and ammunition, weapons design, and all this kind of stuff, somebody finally asked the question, why? Why can't we have both? Why can't we have a rifle caliber that's also going to give us greater overall capabilities on the battlefield while being suppressor ready? So, some secret government agency, I guess, put out the requirement, and they had a very specific list of things that they wanted out of this new cartridge. They wanted it to be 30 caliber, and they wanted it to be able to work with standard AR-15 parts, nothing that required proprietary stuff beyond the barrel, obviously, because we're switching over to a 30 caliber. So it needed to be able to run standard capacity and STANAG magazines. It needed to be able to work off of as many standardized 5.56 AR-15 parts as was possible while giving greater overall mass and being suppressor ready, possibly well enough to function out of a weapon system that would mass the same overall length as, say, I don't know, an MP5 SD. So, manufacturers undertook this proposal or this challenge, and what eventually would come out would be the 300 Blackout from Advanced Armament Corporation. Now, the 300 Blackout was more or less kind of a SAMI standardized application of the 300/221 and the 300 Whisper. Now these were kind of wildcat cartridges prior to, and while having some great success kind of expanding the capabilities of something comparably the same size as a 5.56, they had not necessarily been designed with semi-automatic systems in mind, and they definitely did not have any pressure standardization to them. It was very much so a hand loader's kind of approach. So AAC kind of standardized all of that, and what they did effectively, because you can do this yourself if you have the time and interest, is they took a 5.56 casing and they necked it up to a 30 caliber. So in this case, we have a Spitzer type bullet ranging from anywhere to as small as 110 grains and possibly even smaller, all the way up to 220 grains and possibly even larger. That's a very wide performance index. And we have a 35 millimeter length casing because we are now seating a longer overall bullet, which means that we have to diminish our casing length in order to be able to fit it into an AR-15 bolt and an AR-15 chamber, as well as the AR-15 magazines. Now, some people might ask, and we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves at the moment, but it is an important thing to address, why not a 7.62x39? It's a 30 caliber cartridge, already developed, intermediate cartridge, all this kind of stuff. Why wouldn't they just go with that? And there's a couple of reasons. There's actually quite a bit of things that impact this overall, and a lot of it comes down to basing this around the AR-15 platform. Now, AR-15s chambered in 7.62x39 in a wide variety of flavors exist on the market. And by no means am I saying it's not a thing that you could possibly achieve. But the issue becomes the parts. So, if you look at the 7.62x39mm cartridge, it is drastically more tapered than the 5.56. And just to real quick put everything that we've talked about so far into context, let's go ahead and do a little bit of like cartridge association, because guys, I have a tendency to forget to do this and in a reasonable time, so let's just go ahead and get it out of the way. So on the left is the 7.62x39 that we are currently talking about. In the center is the 300 Blackout, the actual subject of this video. And to the right is the 30 carbine. Now, back on topic. So, with that drastic taper that the 7.62x39 has, this generally requires the magazines to be drastically curved. That's why the AK-47 magazine has this very steep banana type shape to it. The receiver of the AR-15 does not present itself well to that drastic of a magazine curvature. So while there are AR-15 magazines out on the market that can feed 7.62x39, they do not do so successfully. There are actually a lot of issues around those magazines, solidly centered on the magazine itself. So right off the bat, it does not readily adapt to AR-15 magazines, especially if you're looking to be able to take a 5.56 mag, strip all the ammunition out of it, and shove 7.62x39 into it. That's not going to work out that great. So that's not meeting the requirements of the program to begin with. Now, going from there, what about switching over to an AK-47 magazine and having a receiver that could accept that? Well, now we're talking about having a proprietary lower, which, while an option and something that is frequently used out on the market, it's not necessarily, again, meeting the requirements that were outlined, because you do have to go with a completely different receiver that's capable of taking not just the AK-47 magazine, but its rock and lock system. So, not exactly like the best of both worlds that some people might make it out to be. I actually need to mellow that drink out a little bit. Let me add a little bit more lime. So, the 7.62x39 isn't helping out in magazines at all. What about the bolts, though? You run into an issue there as well, because they do not work. That bullet does not work with the standard AR-15 bolt, which means you need to go with a proprietary bolt. Now, in order to be able to stick with an AR-15 sized bolt and bolt carrier, you wind up having to go really thin on the mating surface for the locking lugs around the support for the casing. And that is because the 7.62x39 flares out wider than the 5.56 cartridge casing does. Now, this means that, especially once you start shrinking barrels or adding suppressors and all that kind of stuff, you now have more tension being applied to those locking lugs that now have a thinner overall surface for support. Eventually, you're going to run into an issue with shearing. It might take a while, it might take a couple thousand rounds, but it's going to be more so than what you would run into with a standard AR-15 bolt. Now, another answer to this, of course, would be to go with an AR-10 type bolt, or kind of an intermediate length between the two, because the AR-10 doesn't really have a lot of standardization in its bolts. Which then brings you along like the CMMG Mutant type application. However, that is, again, a proprietary receiver. It's not standard AR-15, pretty much anything, actually, in order to be able to work with this more beefed up system. So now none of the requirements have been met. Whereas the 300 Blackout will readily mate with AR-15 223 5.56 bolts. You just need to change out the barrel. And it's a simple swap of uppers in the worst case scenario. That's not so bad. You can kind of see where someone would consider this advantageous. Now, let's go ahead and talk about some of its performance aspects. Now, with a wide variance of bullet weights, you're also going to have a wide variance of velocities, because that's how math works. Now, keep in mind that there's a lot of things that impact this overall. So when we're talking about supersonics, we're looking at roughly 2,200 feet per second. When we're talking about subsonics, we're getting closer to the 1,000 foot per second, flirting around with that area, and a lot of that's going to be barrel length dependent as well. And we'll get into that more here in just a little bit. So you kind of see a pretty wide fluctuation, and we're going to talk about that more as we get into the actual shooting aspects, because, you know, we'll just go ahead and talk about it now. So with the supersonic loads, you get a fantastic transfer between velocity and energy, and then also when you're talking about internal ballistics and all that kind of stuff, you know, it might drop below that kind of prime cavitation velocity of about 2,000 feet per second. However, we have greater surface area. We have a lot more mass to be able to work with, to be able to exert that energy across a greater overall contact area, as well as I'm pushing a greater, even if it ice picks, I have a larger bullet that's ice picking, as opposed to a 5.56 55 grain or 62 grain bullet that doesn't necessarily have that same mass aspect going along with it. Now, my biggest issue that I see with the 220s between the 110, you know, running from supersonics to subsonics, is that you have a pretty drastic zero shift with that diminishing of velocity. So 220 grain bullet moving at just over 1,000 feet per second is going to have a noticeable point of impact difference between 125 grain bullet moving at 2,200 feet per second. So that's something that you kind of have to keep in mind whenever you're talking about this. A lot of people like to talk about this cartridge as though you can just slap either round in it and it's just going to work, man. It's going to be great. You're not even going to notice a distance. And at close ranges, you may not. But I can tell you, speaking from experience, at 100 yards, there's a noticeable holdover with subsonic ammunition. Just something to keep in mind. Now, let's get into our comparison portion. There's something that the wider firearms community is very guilty of whenever they talk about the 300 Blackout, which is to compare it to the 7.62 by 3.9. And in the past, I have been no different in this regard. I've definitely voiced the opinion that 7.62 by 3.9 is pretty much 300 Blackout, but cheaper. However, let's go ahead and dig into that a little bit more deeply. So if you look at these charts here, and unfortunately, I was really having trouble finding an app that would allow me to do a overlay comparison in charts, so we're going to kind of have to look at numbers and stuff on these charts and kind of compare them back and forth between the two. However, 7.62 by 3.9 and 300 Blackout, even though 7.62 by 3.9 is moving at about 100 feet per second consistently faster, have very comparable ballistic arcs. They are incredibly similar in that overall aspect. However, that doesn't necessarily tell us everything. Now, keep in mind that generally whenever we're talking about 7.62 by 3.9, we're talking about 122 to about 124 grain bullets. You can get heavier, however, those are very niche rounds. The vast majority of like your Tula, your Wolf, Ren Army Standard are running between 122 and 124 grain. Whereas, as I already mentioned, we have a wide variety of 300 Blackout ammunition available. Now, also keep in mind that 7.62 by 3.9 is one of like the first intermediate cartridges, right up there with the 8mm Kurz cartridge developed by the Germans during World War II. The 7.62 by 3.9 was developed before World War II was over. So this is actually a cartridge that was based around a much longer barrel. Like we're talking about an SKS type deal, not so much an AK or even something shorter than that. So when we're talking about overall powder capacity and powder type, it is drastically different from the 300 Blackout. So the 300 Blackout was actually built with like a 9-inch barrel in length. And that's what everyone talks about whenever we talk about the 300 Blackout, is that optimal barrel length is 9 inches. Pretty much all the powder has burned up by 9 inches. And that's because the 300 Blackout utilizes a pistol propellant, which is much faster burning. So if you actually put 300 Blackout into a comparable barrel length with the 7.62 by 3.9, you're going to see a very different performance when it comes to velocity. 7.62 by 3.9 is going to have a little bit more trouble getting up to those velocities. Even the same velocities that it would get out of a 16-inch barrel, if you drop it down to a 9 or 10-inch barrel, you're going to see a pretty drastic reduction in velocity. You're also going to see a massive increase in muzzle blast and muzzle flash at comparable lengths to a 300 Blackout, where muzzle blast isn't that bad. My 6.5-inch SBR that I have reviewed on the channel has a fantastic muzzle blast signature. It's not too much. It is a little blasty, but it's not too much. However, its muzzle flash, people frequently remark that it is not that bad, and that's not even optimal length. We're 2.5 inches under optimal length with that barrel length, and I have no complaints. 100%, I do not think it would turn night into day, unlike a comparably length crank-off type setup, or even something a little bit longer in a crank-off type setup would be a flashbang going off in your face in comparison. So that's one of those aspects. Now, if you guys want to get a little bit deeper into like a lot of the velocity type aspects of barrel length and all that kind of stuff, Mr. Gunsandgear does an excellent and very comprehensive video that I don't even want to try to replicate. That's his Kool-Aid. I'll let him take care of that. But he lays out on his whiteboard of truth, as he refers to it, a very comprehensive discussion on 5.56 300 Blackout with a caveat thrown over to 7.62 by 3.9 and their relation to barrel length as well as velocity. So I will actually throw the link in the description because I think it's that good and I want to make sure you guys take a look at it. So when it comes to short barrel type setups, I would take 300 Blackout with a 7.62 by 3.9 pretty much every day. However, if it comes into a cost evaluation, I could definitely see where some advantages to go to the 300 Blackout. Now, from an overall design, construction type aspect with the bolt and all that kind of stuff, we've already vetted that out pretty thoroughly. But something to consider about 300 Blackout is that it's generally not as available as 7.62 by 3.9 or even 5.56 for that matter, and it's also more expensive. 300 Blackout has really struggled with getting down to the same cost as 5.56 and nowhere near 7.62 by 3.9. So cost is definitely a factor overall in these discussions, which is why niche cartridges have such a hard time catching on. Outside of full-scale military development or military adoption, like 7.62 by 3.9, the 5.56, 308, all those types of cartridges. That's why 10mm, 357 SIG, 7.62 by 3.9, 9 by 39, whenever it really makes its debut or presence known on the market, are all going to really struggle in comparison to these kind of NATO standard cartridges when it comes to availability and cost. Now, in recent years, the 300 Blackout has definitely come down in cost overall. Enough so that I finally added it to my collection. And there are a couple of things that I used, and I talked about this previously, but since we're talking about the cartridge, we might as well talk about it again, that I used to be able to indicate whether or not it had reached a point of availability and cost that made it sustainable to me. One is availability at Walmart. Now, unfortunately, that's not really a matrix that we can use to judge that availability anymore because, well, Walmart stopped carrying anything that isn't a strictly sporting cartridge, which they should have just stuck with being a retailer instead of getting political, but that's a conversation for another time. So now the next thing that I used is what originally would have been a two-part verification of whether or not it had reached sustainability was presence in steel-cased ammunition. Now, I have a video already out on steel-cased ammunition, so if that's something that you kind of want to get my thoughts on, check the description for that. But regardless of whether or not you want to use steel-cased ammunition, having it as a backup kind of in your rear view, right? Like, oh man, I really need ammunition. I really need to get a bunch for a class or a course or a competition, or just because I think things are going crazy and sideways and I want to buy a case for cheap. Steel cased ammunition is where that's going to be at. And if you can't find, like, steel case is always the cheapest option that's out of the market. If you can't find that, then you're going to have to pay for more expensive brass case ammunition. 6.5 Creedmoor is kind of in that status right now, to where there's really not a viable steel cased ammunition out there for it on the market. Now, that doesn't really meet what I would think 6.5 Creedmoor would be used for in general, but you could use that as a metric to kind of decide for yourself if economy of scale has reached where it needs to in order to be able to adopt a new cartridge. Don't want to go down the 6.5 Creedmoor kind of rabbit hole at the moment. Maybe we'll do that in the future. Now, in my opinion, what are the uses of the 300 blackout? The only time 300 blackout has any interest to me is in short barrels and suppressor hosts. I have a very limited interest in a 16-inch barreled 300 blackout. That's not to say that there's not an application, because I think that's an excellent hog hunting type approach. But when you consider that I can get an AR pistol or an SBR and a shorter overall length, and then add a suppressor and get it out to kind of a standard length, either a 14.5 or a 16-inch or just beyond 16 inches, and have a more applicable setup than trying to run a 16-inch gun with a suppressor, that's where 300 blackout becomes interesting. Then also bringing in the fact that powder has pretty much burned up in the short barrel, so even if I go slightly shorter than 9 inches into the suboptimal category, I'm still getting a lot of ballistic capability that I wouldn't be getting out of a comparably length 5.56 chambered rifle, which is one of those things to think about, because a lot of people who want to talk about barrel length and how 9 inches is optimal burn for 300 blackout, I'm pretty sure all of them have 16-inch AR, like 5.56 chambered AR-15s in their closets, which the 5.56 was originally developed for a 20-inch gun. So, come on guys, we're really picking a weird spot to split hairs at. Now, that's not to say longer isn't better, just like it's not to say that shorter isn't better, but the key thing for me with the 300 blackout are short barrels. I want a nice compact package throwing a 30 caliber cartridge that's going to give me greater overall capability, especially when I pair it with a suppressor. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on the 300 blackout cartridge. So, I hope you guys found this interesting overall, and have a good day.